Uh, yeah, so I don't know.
You mean Maria?
No, Patricia.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I missed that, unfortunately, but I'll catch the recording.
Yes, I guess. Yeah, there's lots of interesting.
We do have a keynote speaker from this morning who was unable to have her video played due to the tight time. So we are very, very grateful that Patricia Kameri Mebote, professor, colleague of ours, many years engaged in the international environmental law community, and now, of course, also the director of legal for the United Nations Environment Program, has kindly agreed to send us a keynote speech, which will be played for the next 3 minutes in this hall. And then we will start directly with, coincidentally, some of our colleagues from the United Nations and from especially the FAO, the UNFCCC Secretariat, the Commonwealth Secretariat, UN Habitat, and of course, Meyer Brown, in presenting a toolkit that has been created in this area. Thank you very, very much. The other launches that were going to be held tonight are going to be held during the Hunterian Gallery reception, which will be much more beautiful and will have more food and drink, which is quite important. So I'm going to ask our team to play Patricia's keynote, and then we will go straight into all of the afternoon sessions, especially this starring one that is about to happen here. Thank you.
Warm greetings from Nairobi. It is an honor for me to address you at this distinguished event, and I'm sorry I could not be with you in person. This year's event comes at a critical moment. Today, we convene on the sidelines of COP26. Countries are being asked to take ambitious steps to avert a global crisis. As the UN Secretary General said in his opening remarks at this conference, the climate situation is not improving. Countries must choose to safeguard our future and save humanity. We know why this is important. You know why this is important. I don't want to refer you to the multitude of reports, including our own UNEP emissions gap report, that highlight just how far countries must go to safeguard our future. I would instead like to focus on law. The focus of this panel, Global Legal Responses to Climate Change, is so important. A 2019 Grantham Research Institute analysis shows that all 192 country signatories to the Paris Agreement have at least one or major policy instrument addressing climate change or the transition to a low carbon economy. And of those, 139 have framework laws that address climate mitigation or adaptation holistically. Law creates a foundation for environmental governance and plays a key role in enabling countries to reach the targets and objectives set under the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. But the establishment of laws is not enough. The 2019 First Global Report on Environmental Rule of Law by UNEP places emphasis on the rule of law as a critical element in fair and effective laws. Laws must be clear, consistent with human rights, inclusively developed, and should promote transparency and accountability. Without environmental rule of law, development cannot be sustainable. Moreover, the benefits of environmental rule of law go beyond direct improvement of environmental protection and management. Law reform that is built on principles of environmental rule of law can lead to benefits in public health. It can preserve financial resources, build public trust in the government, and strengthen peace and security. The importance of upholding human rights obligations in environmental law could not be better underscored by the recent landmark resolution by the UN Human Rights Council. On 8th October, the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution recognizing the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. In so doing, it called on states to adopt policies for the enjoyment of this right. Climate change will undoubtedly have far-reaching impacts on human rights, including this one, and raises issues of justice and equity. We also see that climate litigation is becoming an increasingly more powerful driver of law reform globally. The UNEP Global Climate Litigation Report 2020 shows that climate change litigation has led to the establishment of new climate goals, more extensive climate regulations, and stronger environmental impact assessment regulations in countries. Litigation has often sought to require the government to enact policies for climate change mitigation, such as greenhouse gas mitigation targets and plans, or develop adaptation strategies. In some instances, cases have actually focused on rights of future generations, as well as rights of underrepresented sectors such as women. In many cases, these claims were linked with constitutional rights, like the equality rights, where you're talking about youth and women. What this highlights is that climate actions are and should be taken at all levels by all actors. This includes regulatory agencies, parliaments, and legal professionals such as judges, prosecutors, and enforcement authorities, as well as youth, indigenous people, private sector, and others. Under the 5th Montevideo Program for the Development and Periodic Review of Environmental Law, UNEP is committed to supporting member states in the implementation of environmental rule of law and strengthening the capacity of all actors to address environmental issues. With climate change as one of the main priorities of the organization, UNEP provides guidance, advice, and capacity building to enable low emission economic development and promote climate change adaptation and resilience. UNEP's 2021 emissions gap report notes that emissions reduction commitments must be urgently translated into policies and actions and integrated into nationally determined contributions if we are to expect concrete change. Not only are strong laws and institutions necessary to ensure that this is achieved, but all stakeholders must play a role in developing these laws, must understand their rights and responsibilities, and must have access to mechanisms to ensure accountability under the law if such laws are to be effective. Exchanges such as these happening in this event are an important opportunity to reflect on the importance of environmental rule of law in creating the future we want. I am grateful for the opportunity to participate in this valuable discussion, and I thank you for your attention.
Are we ready to start? Perfect, thanks. If you can start with the slides, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session titled Moving Towards High Ambition Implementation of the Paris Agreement with the Law and Climate Change Toolkit. It's an honor to chair the session and to be on stage and on screen with colleagues from the Commonwealth Secretariat, the United Nations Environment Programme, United Nations Climate Change Secretariat, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, UN Habitat, and Mayor Brown. Slide, please. Slide, please. Thanks. So our agenda for the session is as follows. I will start off with a brief introduction to the toolkit and a toolkit demonstration. My name is Francisca Pretorius, and I'm the head of the Office of Civil and Criminal Justice Reform at the Commonwealth Secretariat. Then Ben Ojolek from the United Nations Environment Programme will provide us with a more in-depth background of the toolkit and tell us about one of the modules, the urban planning module. After that, Valerie Johnston from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, who is joining us all the way from Canada today. Thank you, Valerie, for getting up so early. We'll talk about the agriculture module. Then Andre Hayder from Mayor Brown will discuss the energy module, and he will tell us about the methodology their team used to update the module recently and some energy trends that they noticed. After that, we'll go back to Ben. He will share some practical examples of how we've used the toolkit, and he will also talk about next steps for the toolkit. And finally, my colleague Matthew Moorhead will lead some panel questions and answers, as well as audience questions and answers. Slide, please. So at the Commonwealth Secretariat, the issue of climate change is one that we've been grappling with for a really long time. The current Secretary General in particular has been at the forefront of advocating for action on climate change, especially considering that many small and vulnerable island states are part of the Commonwealth family. These states not only contribute to the crisis the least, but they also have the most unequal voice on the world stage. Small and vulnerable states have been living with this threat daily. For them, this has long been a matter of life and death. The past few years have forced not only the small states, but also the rest of the world to reckon with the current levels of warming in close quarters. What is, however, encouraging is that the past few years have also seen a rise in the number of countries that have introduced legislation to support their nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement. It is imperative that as policymakers around the world and in Glasgow this very day, pledge government action to cut emissions in several areas, that our domestic legislation also reflects this resolve. So as countries continue to tailor existing legislative frameworks to respond to the aims and ambitions of the Paris Agreement and commitments made under NDCs, the Law Climate Change Toolkit assists countries to identify gaps between their commitments and their existing legislation, and to help translate the level and scope of their commitments into domestic frameworks across different sectors. The Commonwealth Secretariat is proud to have been involved with the toolkit since its inception with our core partners, UNEP and the UN Climate Change Secretariat. And the toolkit really represents a key plank of our climate change commitment to our member countries. As we know, member countries, and in particular small island developing countries, face the existential threat of climate change, actually with particular resource constraints. So this toolkit is designed to provide practical, direct, accessible help to ease constraints that stand in the way of legislating effectively. The toolkit has actually been warmly welcomed by the Commonwealth family and around the world, and we continue to help member states use the toolkit in their legislative processes. At present, for example, we are utilizing the toolkit to assist the Caribbean country of Dominica to conduct an all-of-society resilience review with a view to adapting the island to the climate-related difficulties to come. Well, Ben will tell you more about how the toolkit was conceived and how it is organized, and the other speakers will discuss details of the different modules. I will briefly tell you how to use the toolkit. So if you look on the slide, you will see the URL for the website. So if you register for the first time, you will be asked to put in your email address. You will get an email to create a password. Of course, please go and check your spam folders to set up your password. So when you've registered and you visit the website, this is the page that you land on. And this gives you an overview of our core functionalities. Please note that the lessons learned, the one on the right, we're still in the development stage of that one. Slide, please. So the first functionality is the Legislation Explorer page. It's a database of laws related to climate change. Slide, please. On the right-hand side, you'll see there's a list of filters. You can filter by legal area, by country type, by type of legal instrument, cross-cutting categories, or a number of other categories. Slide, please. Now, what I've done here is going down on some drop-down menus. You can see each section of each module has two further levels below that, and all categorized according to the related legal areas. By way of example, we've selected here that under the energy module, the third level, renewable energy obligations for energy users. If I search by these parameters or tags, we can go to the next slide to see the returned results. So on the left, you'll note that we have 7 returned results. So please note that the intent of the toolkit is not to exhaustively include all legislative instruments from around the world that may overlap on this topic, but rather choose and display representative examples to give the user an idea of what certain provisions for specific topics might look like. So we can see that each of the returned laws has the selected tag in yellow, as well as a number of other tags. Slide, please. So then we move to the second core functionality, the legal assessment tool. And I think this is the best part of the toolkit. The legal assessment tool was designed to allow users to assess their legal regimes through a series of simple yes and no questions. With each yes answer, you may be given further questions, while no answer will identify a gap in the legislation that corresponds to one of our tags that I showed in the earlier Legislation Explorer. Slide, please. So on the screen, I have chosen to review laws related to energy production and renewable energy. There's no need to answer sections or modules in order. You can choose whatever suits your needs at that point. So the first question to come up relates to the broader notion of whether the country has legislation regulating or creating obligations related to renewable energy production and consumption. So if I say no and press view results, it would return a gap. If I say yes, next slide, please. I am given an additional set of questions, each elaborating on one of the tags I mentioned earlier. So an example, I've clicked no on the second question and yes to all the other questions. I can now click view results at the bottom. Slide, please. When you view the results, you see that the no answer returned a single gap, which corresponds to the key term or the tag. Under this identified gap, we've gone through laws and regulations from around the world to find 10 suggested provisions that would respond to the identified gap. So looking at the list of provisions, now let's click on the Philippines, section 10 and 11. Slide, please. So here are the provisions that were tagged against the identified gap, both related to renewable energy obligations for energy users. So when you do your own assessments, you may be answering no to dozens of questions, possibly returning several pages worth of results, each corresponding to a gap. Slide, please. Then the final core functionality is the assessment profile, which is information on climate change from all countries in the world. The information is updated quite regularly, but users may also have the opportunity to amend any inaccurate information. Slide, please. So now that you know how to use the toolkit, we will move on to Ben. Ben is an associate legal officer within the Law Division of the United Nations Environment Programme. As a member of the National Environmental Law Unit, he supports countries in strengthening their legal and institutional frameworks through review of legislative and regulatory instruments and provision of legal assistance and capacity building tools. Ben has a background in private practice, environmental law and litigation in Canada, with current interest in international law, governance and legislative development and design. He was called to the bar in Ontario, Canada in 2017, after obtaining his Juris Doctor with a specialization in environmental law from Dalhousie University in Canada in 2016. Over to you, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you, Fran. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. Thank you. So hi to everyone watching in person or online. So as Fran said, my name is Ben Ojalik and I'm an Associate Legal Officer here at the United Nations Environment Programme, and I'm stationed at the headquarters office in Nairobi, Kenya. So I'm here today to introduce you to the story behind the Law and Climate Change Toolkit and to give you a bit of an insight into how it was developed and how it's been used, as well as where it might go in the mid to long term. So the toolkit has been in development since 2016 and was originally conceived as a globally accessible resource to help countries put in place legal frameworks necessary for effective domestic implementation of the Paris Agreement and nationally determined contributions. It was originally conceived by the 3 core partners who all continue to contribute to its, sorry, next slide, please. And one more as well, thank you. Perfect, thanks. So yes, so all core partners continue to contribute to its growth and development. Now, in designing the toolkit, the developers recognized that law related to climate change is fundamentally interdisciplinary. So climate change law is not confined to one legislative instrument in each country, but instead is often sourced from a spectrum of legal areas, including agriculture or forestry, transportation, or laws directly governing the energy industry, for example. So as a result of this complexity, the toolkit was developed over time with the help of a number of partners and authorities having expertise in different areas of law that may overlap with climate change, including some of the partners here at this presentation, Food and Agriculture Organization, UN Habitat, and Mayor Brown. Now, at this point, I'd also like to particularly mention the brilliant and kind folks at OdaWeb and LegisPro, who have been running the web development and software end of this toolkit and have been going above and beyond for years, but especially over the past 6 to 12 months to constantly improve the material available on the website. So although the site as you see it is still a work in progress, it is rapidly progressing due to their hard work. Next slide, please. Thanks. So as designed, the toolkit is aimed at those policymakers within governments who may be responsible for advising on climate law and policy, or those working with them who have some responsibility related to legislative or policy development. Now, although it was designed to be used by governments, it's also been used in the past by those in academia, NGOs, private practice, or independent researchers, for example. Now, we currently have 4 main areas of law reflected on the site. So we've got dedicated climate laws, energy law, we have agriculture and forestry, which also includes aquaculture, and we have urban planning law. Now, each of these is a standalone module divided into sections, and we have plans to add additional modules in the future. Next slide, please. So the current areas of law on the toolkit all have clear components that overlap with climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, and sustainable practices. Now, likewise, the proposed future modules will also ideally represent areas that have clear links to greenhouse gas reduction and the Paris Agreement, and will also be areas that are undergoing or will be undergoing legislative reform or development in the near future. So for example, UNEP recognizes that the transport sector accounts for approximately 25% of all energy-related greenhouse gas emissions globally, and is responsible for around 3.2 million premature deaths annually. So it's quite common for countries to have dedicated legislative instruments related to transport law, and to have provisions within these legislation or legislative instruments related to sustainable transport or transport infrastructure. So further, due to the advent and ongoing development of electric vehicles or sustainable transport and infrastructure, it's likely that many countries around the world will be faced with the question of how to develop or refine their existing legislative regime to make transportation legislation more climate friendly. So in response to this, there are plans on our end for future development of a transportation module, among other modules. Next slide, please. Now, just to quickly get into the nitty-gritty here, so the toolkit is set up in a modular manner, with the 4 modules that I mentioned earlier, all having sections and subsections, or second and third level taxonomic terms and corresponding questions underneath. So dividing it up in this manner facilitates incremental development of modules and addition of new sections as well over time as resources and future needs permit. So the modules are developed through an iterative process of review, wherein the 3 core partners engage with subject matter experts to construct the overall framework of the module, and then work backwards to fill in questions related to the taxonomy. So through many rounds of feedback and development, where all core partners and subject experts have several rounds of say in how the modules are presented and how the modules are formulated and the questions, we land on a version of a module as represented in the slide here. So the aim is really to distill each broader concept reflected in a taxonomic term down into the simplest version of a question, such that a user is faced with an unambiguous question directed at the essence of a legal concept or provision. So having lawyers and others familiar with law boil down the questions by ensuring all language is legally precise, it really reduces the risk of users feeling unsure about their responses and ensures that when the assessment is complete, the user is presented with a targeted list of legislative provisions that directly responds to their needs. Now, I just wanted to highlight this step to give an insight into how this toolkit is, it's not really an effort of just the 3 core partner organizations, but rather is a truly collaborative effort involving a review process with continuous feedback and input from many organizations. Now, efforts such as this are particularly important and in line with the One UN policy in recognition that matters related to climate change, they can't be solved in isolation. So instead, these efforts require the care and attention of multiple and varied actors, each responsible for different areas of expertise. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now just to give a bit of an introduction into the urban planning module of the toolkit, which I'll talk more about later. So its development was spearheaded by our legal counterparts at UN Habitat, who provided expert advice and really took the lead in designing the module from the ground up. Their work, it also included identifying over 50 laws from around the world that were representative of the developed taxonomy and tagging those laws against their developed legal taxonomy at the provision level. Urban areas are a clear candidate as well for heightened focus of legislative development in relation to climate change. So these areas, they account for 2/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions and global energy consumption, and have also been severely impacted by increasing extreme weather events as well. So with around 55% of the world currently living in urban areas, and this is also predicted to increase to around 68% by 2050, there's this dual issue of increased emissions in concentrated locations, while also having a heightened risk of humanity being exposed to adverse effects related to these increased emissions in urban areas. So the urban planning module is really developed in recognition of this complex issue. So as cities and urban areas can be planned and designed in a manner that reduces their environmental impacts, while also considering resilience and adaptation to climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, the toolkit module on urban planning ensures that those tasked with developing laws related to the subject take a whole of sector approach to emphasizing climate-friendly urbanization. So next slide, please. Thank you. So now I just turn the presentation back over to Fran, and I'll come back later to give a bit more of an insight into that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. I'm going to hand it over to Andre now. He's an associate in the London office of Mayor Brown. He advises clients on a variety of intellectual property, technology, data protection, and cybersecurity matters. Sorry, next slide, I forgot to say that. Andre also has a particular interest in ESG implications of new technologies. He maintains an active pro bono practice. He's a qualified solicitor in England and Wales, and he has an undergraduate degree in international relations from the University of St. Andrews. Thank you, Andre.
Thank you, Fran, and thank you for inviting us over up here to Glasgow to present on the work that we have done on the energy module with you. Next slide, please, and the next one again. Before I introduce the energy module and what it's about, I just wanted to look for a moment at why we are focusing on energy and energy law. And we know, and research shows, that energy supply and the sector of energy supply is actually the biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the world, ranging anywhere between 35 to 40% of all the greenhouse gas emissions. There's also projections that, if nothing is done, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are coming from the energy supply sector will double or even triple in the next 30 years. And so it's becoming very, very clear that if we really want to achieve the aims of the Paris Agreement and want to implement the nationally determined contributions, we do need to look at energy laws and how the energy laws are implementing all of these aims that we are hoping for and working towards. Next slide, please. So the energy module, really what this is it's looking at primary national and supranational legislation across the world. As Fran previously mentioned, this is not supposed to be a very comprehensive or incredibly comprehensive survey of all energy laws anywhere in the world. Rather, it is a representative sample of energy laws, and especially energy laws that have been implemented post the Paris Agreement. Commonwealth Secretariat has approached Mayor Brown to help them with updating the resource that they already had. And there were 24 energy laws which they have asked us to update, but also, implement and tag new legislation that has been passed since 2015 in order to find out, where is the good practice. And so the legislation explorer and the legislation assessment can work for the users of the toolkit. What the Commonwealth Secretariat and the UN partners also gave us is a taxonomy to use when identifying this legislation and tagging it. And you can see on the slide, it really looks at 4 wide areas. It is energy systems, energy production and renewable energy, energy efficiency, and energy market regulation. Next slide, please. And, when we start with this task, we really had to get our head around what do we mean by energy law? Because if you search for the word energy or any translation of energy in different languages, you will just get hundreds or thousands of hits in different legislation databases. And so it was really for us to find out, how do we narrow down this big task into something that is manageable and also practical to use for the people who use the toolkit. And fortunately, we got some guardrails for the Commonwealth Secretariat and the UN partners. And it was, what I already mentioned, focusing on primary legislation and focusing on legislation that is done on the national or supranational level. The other assumption, or when we were coming up with this methodology, is we look at legislation that is available in public sources. So something that, you and I, we can all find online. And the other point that I do want to flag here is we are focusing on legislation available from public sources in English language. And although this might sound slightly limiting, because English is not the working language for majority of the countries in the world, it's not the official language. What we found out during this exercise is that actually a lot of energy legislation has been translated into English, and there are official translations for it, even for countries that do not use English as their working or official language. And really this is because if the countries want to attract investment, if the countries want to work with international partners, having official translations of this legislation is usually very beneficial. And although I mentioned here that we focus on legislation in English, we actually did some tagging of legislation in French and German as well. But primarily what we are focusing is official English translations. And then the final point that I want to mention on this slide as well is, it is not comprehensive, covering absolutely every single country in the world, but we are trying to come up with, a representative sample covering different regions, covering different levels of development, covering, whether it's small island countries or big countries like Russia, have a representative sample of different countries and their legislation and how they are trying to implement the Paris Agreement. And overall, as a part of this exercise, we updated the 24 laws that were already on the toolkit, came up with any amendments to them, and tagged additional 58 energy laws using the taxonomy that was provided to us. Next slide, please. And really what I want to focus on the second part of this brief introduction into the energy module is what we have found out when we are going through this 24 plus 58 pieces of legislation. And the first thing that was quite striking, but maybe not that surprising, is that a lot of the national determined contributions commitments and the aims of the Paris agreements have not necessarily always been translated into primary energy legislation. And I mentioned a wee while ago that this was not necessarily surprising. And the reason why I'm saying that is a lot of this implementation of the national determined contributions, those that have been announced this week or throughout this year, but even previously after Paris, some of them might have been done through secondary legislation, whether it's through executive orders, whether it's through other delegated legislation, they would not necessarily always be enshrined in primary legislation. The second point that we found when doing the survey of these energy laws is that a lot of these national determined contributions and energy laws implementing the Paris Agreement are not necessarily contained in what we would call pure energy laws. There will be budget bills, there will be tax bills that are actually implementing these commitments, and those would not be captured when we are surveying primary energy legislation. And there are different reasons why countries go into this. There might be political reasons, while instead of having a specific energy law, you need to put it into a budget bill. The US is a primary example right now, but this is what we found as a part of our tagging process. Next slide, please. And really what I want to focus on right now is something that we found in relation to renewable energy. And something what we found definitely is that there has been a rise in renewable energy targets in the primary legislation. So more and more countries are actually enshrining in their primary energy legislation that they have a renewable energy target. But the caveat is the second point on the slide. And when we are talking about renewable energy, the definitions is not consistent. Some countries will be implementing renewable energy targets. Some countries will be, implementing clean energy targets. Some countries will have low carbon energy targets. And so you can't really compare it like to like. The big things that we have seen when reviewing this is, for example, nuclear energy, things about biomass, and these targets might have, varied across the different pieces of legislation. I wanted to highlight 3 things that we found slightly surprising, but maybe not that surprising when we actually thought about, what we found. And one of them is there was very little mention of specific decarbonization technologies in this primary legislation. This legislation was looking at overarching aims, but at that level, it would not mention, for example, offshore wind or onshore wind very often. It wouldn't mention geothermal energy very often. There are obviously certain exemptions, specific, jurisdictions, but generally, this was one of our findings. The other point that I personally, when going through this exercise, found quite surprising is there was very, very little legislative commitment to transition away from coal power. And I wonder if this is actually something that might change after the announcements of this week, where several countries have now made the official public commitment that they will be transitioning from coal power. So I think that's an area to watch for. And then the final point that we notice hasn't actually been mentioned that often is carbon capture and storage. And probably, this might not be actually that surprising when you think about it, because this technology, CCS, is not that developed. It hasn't actually been implemented on a very wide scale. And we know that legislation often, plays a catch up with the technology, and it's usually the technology is there first, and only there the legislators are trying to regulate it and, implement it and make it more beneficial to everybody. But it's another point that we flag that might change over the next couple of years that the energy legislation will be going through. And this is my introduction to the energy module. I will hand over to Fran now to take us to the other modules.
Thank you so much, Andre. Next slide, please. There's a disclaimer, and then the next one. And the next one, thanks. I just quickly want to pause here and say thank you so much to Andre and his team. They put in an incredible amount of hours updating this energy module, most of it pro bono. Thank you so much. It was amazing. So now we're turning to Valerie Johnston. She's a Canadian national who has worked with the United Nations for over 20 years. She's currently engaged with the Food and Agriculture Organization based in Rome as a development law expert. She specializes in capacity development and technical advice to member countries on the use of legal instruments to achieve integrated water resources management and climate change mitigation and adaptation in the agriculture sectors. Over to you, Valerie. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Fran, and good afternoon to everyone in the room and joining us online. It's a wonderful opportunity, and I appreciate it very much. I'm going to talk to you about, as introduced by Fran and the others, about the agriculture module of the toolkit. Next slide, please. And one again. The module was developed by my office, principally by my office, in collaboration with the core partners of the toolkit. And similarly to what was said at the introduction of the energy module presentation, I'm here to tell you why do we need to talk about agriculture when we are discussing methods of addressing climate change. Well, of course, climate change, as most of us know, is not only about the energy and transport sectors, but agriculture and the whole agriculture sector, meaning the entire value chain of agriculture, forestry and fisheries is also very relevant. There's some just basic data I've pulled out from the statistics and research, which shows that 23% of net anthropogenic emissions from the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sectors come from the agriculture sector. And at the same time, if we look at the entire food system, we reach levels of 25 to 30% of total GHG emissions. Next slide, please. So again, we've seen that agriculture, climate change has had very detrimental effects on agricultural production due to extreme weather events, which leads to economic loss, important GDP losses in countries who are heavily dependent on agriculture, especially in developing countries. And in particular, FAO recognizes that within these agriculturally dependent economies, it's the small scale producers and rural farmers who suffer disproportionate consequences on their food security and livelihoods. Therefore, this makes, adaptation and building resilience in these sectors absolutely crucial. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has, with it and its effects on agriculture and on food systems and distribution, only highlighted the need to transition to a more greener and equitable and resilient agriculture production system. Next slide, please. So before I talk about this slide that's currently up at the moment, we have seen that all countries legislate their agricultural sectors rather heavily. There's countries where we find general agricultural laws which regulate land use, broader issues such as, land management, farming, as well as more specific issues related to agriculture, such as livestock production, manure management, plant and animal health, processing of agricultural products, regulation of the industry and industrial aspects, transport of agricultural products, as well as the institutional aspects of agricultural management. Agriculture is also influenced by environmental laws, water laws, and forestry laws. All these aspects will impact on the operation of agricultural activities and production. However, what we have noticed, and rather a long time ago now, is that climate change per se is rarely addressed directly in let's say a body of law within any given country that covers or is related to the agriculture sector. Therefore, there is this major gap. Again, as has been said, the discussions are often dominated in the climate change arena by transport and energy, but agriculture and agri-food systems are an important part of the solution as well to the climate crisis. And as we know, these sectors have been suffering some of its worst impacts. The slide we see now is what's called the Koronivia roadmap. So for those who don't know, the 2017 Koronivia joint decision on agriculture was a decision that emanated from the governing bodies of the UN Framework on Convention on Climate Change in 2017. And why it's very important and relevant for the FAO, where I work, is the fact that it concentrates on the agriculture sector. And this is the roadmap, the working roadmap of the Koronivia decision. And if we look at some of the main topics that have been, that were in 2017 set out as being the areas where parties agreed to concentrate their work and discussions, we see things like nutrient use and manure management, livestock management, the socioeconomic and food security dimensions, and sustainable land and water management. These are all areas that are clearly very much relevant to FAO and the agriculture sectors. Next slide, please. So this is basically what the agriculture module in the Climate Change Toolkit is built by. It contains these four main sections: crops and livestock, land use and management, forestry, and fisheries and aquaculture. As was said by my colleagues before me, each section will be divided into subsections and sub-questions, which have been purposely designed to reflect not only the main themes of the Koronivia work plan, which we saw on the previous slide, but any and all themes and aspects of agriculture and agriculture production and use and management of natural resources that FAO, through its technical research and knowledge, considers to be of relevance to either mitigating climate change or promoting or assisting adaptation to climate change in the agriculture and food sectors. So we have these four main sections, which contain very specific questions related to laws and legal instruments in dealing with these specific subjects. Then we have what I've put in the central box, these sort of cross-cutting themes: procedural rights, integrated approaches, and the others we see. These are cross-cutting themes which are relevant to all four main topics, and you'll find in the module questionnaire in the assessment section questions relating to these cross-cutting themes as well. Next slide, please. So to get directly into the nitty-gritty, I've pulled out one example of a question that one would find if one goes into the forestry section of the agriculture module. And it's rather self-explanatory. You see the main sort of leading question topic area on the top left, and then you have your first main question underneath it. Does your country have provisions of legislation or regulations on forest management? This is just an example of a real question that's in there. And then depending on the answer the user provides, they get prompted to the next question, which will be the second level question, which will go into more detail with respect to the first question, and so on until we reach the end of the tier system of questions. And the final answers would lead to either an area of improvement. It would lead the user to either an area of improvement or a gap in the legislation, again, all measured against Paris commitment, sort of assessed against Paris commitment, Paris Agreement commitments, with a specific example, usually more than one, of a law that we have found that addresses that specific point. Next slide, please. This is another example of a question pulled out directly from our forestry section. This is about security of forest tenure rights, which is another issue that FAO works a lot on. And again, either the user may answer yes, in which case they get prompted to a more specific question, or they may answer in the negative and eventually at the end be directed to an example of legislation from another country where we found it. Same issue applied to us when we were developing the agriculture module and finding legislation to populate the database of laws behind this. We were limited to inserting legislation in the English language, which is a limitation, but for the moment, that's what we were able to do. We have a cross-cutting and globally representative collection of laws that the user would be able to draw upon. Next slide, please. While we're on the topic of forestry, I also wanted to mention the REDD+ mechanism. Some of you may already have heard of this. This is a mechanism that was set up by the UNFCCC for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation to assist member states in developing their policies and actions in that regard. And of course, we know that many NDCs do include measures to reduce deforestation and forest degradation. We have at FAO a team that works on the REDD+ program and assists countries to achieve REDD+ goals. And within this work, the UN REDD program has certainly prioritized the development of lawmaking and legal reforms in this area. And I just wanted to point out, of course, that achieving deforestation and reducing forest degradation is not only about intervening in the forestry sector, but also can involve many other sectors, such as, for example, environmental laws, agriculture laws. FAO promotes and recognizes the role of agroforestry, for example, investment laws and rural finance provisions, as well as budgets. Therefore, this is all these aspects are also reflected in the forestry section of the agriculture module. Next slide, please. Yes, here I've just quickly pulled out a few other examples from the other main sections of the agriculture module, which are land use management, crops and livestock, and fisheries and aquaculture. These are just some examples of the type of question or the type of, let's say, topics that are covered by the very specific questions that a user will find in that section of the module. Next slide, please. At FAO, in the Development Law Service, where I work, we have developed a strategy on law and climate change, which is heavily centered on capacity development and training of lawmakers and policymakers, should they make a request to us to assist them in climate proofing, as we say, climate proofing their agriculture legislation. We, using the knowledge, the very precious knowledge that we have gathered in developing the agriculture module of the toolkit, we are able to go in and make a gaps and needs assessment of the legal system and of the legal, let's say, framework governing food and agriculture, and to make recommendations for reform or legislative improvements. Next slide, please. Our office works very much in this area, in all areas of agricultural law and food systems and natural resources. And next slide, please. And what I wanted to, of course, underline is that we are very well aware in our office, in our work, that translating or cutting and pasting, let's say, one law that from one country to another is not the answer. And therefore, the way we address the provision of advice, technical legal advice to any given country in any given area is very much based on these four aspects that you see in the slide on the screen at the moment. We very much make our advice tailor-made to reflect the circumstances and realities of a country, of a specific country or of a specific legal system. The process of developing recommendations or legislative drafting is participatory, multidisciplinary, and independent. Next slide, please. So having said that, I thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions you have on the development of the agricultural law module. Our office is available to assist member states in piloting and implementing any resulting recommendations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valerie. Really appreciate it. Can we have the next slide, please? Oh, sorry. Yay, thanks, Valerie. We are running a little bit out of time, so we're going to rush a tiny bit. I'm going to hand back over to Ben, who's going to tell us a little bit more, or give some practical examples of how this toolkit has been used. Over to you, Ben.
Thanks again, Fran. So following up on my earlier presentation, You may be wondering how the toolkit might help you in the legislative context. So next slide, please. And next slide again. Thanks. Thank you. So now, after having seen the operational side of the toolkit, it may now be a bit more evident that it can be used to facilitate development of a legislative inventory assessing large areas of law in relatively short amounts of time. So once gaps are identified, you're presented with exemplary provisions that may address these gaps, giving you an idea of how to tailor style and content to develop your own provisions to meet these same purposes. Now, although this makes sense in theory, the question then arises as to how it can be done in practice. So next slide, please. All right, so now that we've discussed how the toolkit can be used in the abstract to affect legislative change, it may be helpful to give a real-world example in which the toolkit was used to assess existing laws and legislative frameworks, and then supporting the development of a strengthened climate law framework at the state level. Now, please bear in mind, I'm just providing a general overview of a research project to give you an idea of how the toolkit can be used. So for specific inquiries into this particular research, I can direct you to the researchers as the authorities on the project. Next slide, please. Thank you. So following development and launch of the urban planning module, colleagues at UN Habitat began to work together with academics at the University of Michigan, using the module as the basis for a critical assessment of the urban planning legal framework as it related to climate change in Rajasthan, India. Now, Rajasthan is the largest state by area and the 7th largest in population, and has a government that's taken steps toward enacting legislation to strengthen climate change action in relation to urban planning practices. So it was a natural candidate for this research. Now, the research focused on two main instruments with the overall goal of informing the state government on how to incorporate climate change related legislation and strategy into existing urban policy and territorial planning. Next slide, please. Thanks. So the 5 categories of the module were set out with each taxonomic term used in the module being displayed under its corresponding section, as you can see on the slide here. So we can see here there are 5 sections of the module with each of the subsections under those sections designated as terms in the assessment. Next slide, please. So using their established research method, the researchers reviewed the instruments that I mentioned earlier to determine areas of strength and areas of improvement in the urban planning framework in Rajasthan, using frequency of mentions of each taxonomic term to form the basis of the analysis. So the chart here indicates that under, for example, the multi-sector governance section of the module, the legislative framework assessed by the researchers can be strengthened by improving data collection and sharing, and also the local government's mandate for urban planning in urban areas. So within the final product research paper, the researchers elaborate on precisely why certain areas of improvement are identified and what it might look like to strengthen those areas. Next slide, please. So following assessment and subsequent analysis, the researchers were able to come up with a series of recommendations for each section of the module based on the findings of the report. So we can see here, the slide indicates the final recommendations from the researchers in relation to the 1 subsection on multi-level governance. Now, although brief, hopefully this overview has given you a bit of an indication of how the toolkit can be used for a targeted assessment of legislative frameworks of a state, a country, or a region. So the full results here of the research are freely available on the internet, and I urge you all to please, of course, look up the final reports if you want more information, as these reports are quite detailed and very, very insightful. Now, it's also important to note that the core partners were not directly involved in this research. Instead, using the legal assessment feature of the toolkit, researchers were able to identify on their own key priority areas for legislative development through the modules. Now, following finalization of the modules, we hope to have developed an intuitive platform that allows users to take advantage of the toolkit to conduct their own research, provide legislative development advice, and ultimately use the toolkit in a manner that's most practical for their purposes. Next slide, please. So you've seen how the toolkit was developed and how it can be used, but what are the next steps for the toolkit? Next slide, please. All right, so although we've developed the three main functionalities, as we've mentioned earlier, the final functionality, the lessons learned component, is still yet to be developed. So given the successes of the past, it's a little bit easier to see how the future functionality may be developed. As the toolkit grows and evolves over time and is used to affect change in countries and regions throughout the world, the lessons learned rather, functionality may serve as a bit of a good practices repository or a compilation of success stories, for example. So whether this is user-fed or populated by the core partners remains to be seen, but it is clear that with the momentum we've experienced over the past couple of years, we'll be building on the initial experiences and lessons learned to allow users to better understand how this resource might be put to use for the benefits of countries around the world. Next slide, please. We're currently in the process of updating the two original modules. So as mentioned earlier, the overarching climate change laws and the energy module to ensure the laws tagged under those areas reflect the most up-to-date information available. We've also been working with selected countries to combine the toolkit with other forms of research in order to assist in legislative assessment and reform for them. In the longer term as well, we are planning on developing a number of other modules on areas overlapping with climate change, as well as developing the lessons learned component, and also working to integrate the toolkit into national technical assistance programs related to climate law and policy. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just here, if you're interested in getting in touch with any of the core partners, you can find contact information for representatives on this slide. My name is there, as well as my colleague Renee here at UNEP. And we have as well Fran and Matt there, and then Anna Charles from UN Climate Change. And then alternatively, you can also speak with anyone presenting in person right now. Next slide, please. Many thanks to all for listening, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Ben. Appreciate it. So that concludes the presentations. Can I go to the next slide, please? I'm now going to ask my colleague Matt to pose some questions to the panelists, and if there's any time left, which I doubt, then we will see if there's Q&A time from the audience. Matt is a legal advisor with the Commonwealth Secretariat, where he specializes in developing legal tools to promote development outcomes and provide access to justice. Before joining the Commonwealth, Matt was at the World Bank and at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Over to you, Matt. Thank you.
Thanks, Fran. Yes, as you say, we are running out of time. I'm not going to attempt to try and add anything more substantive myself on the toolkit on top of those excellent presentations, which I hope you enjoyed. So with the time we have left, I think maybe it would be good to end on a forward-looking note. We have Andre here with us, of course, who's been working on the energy module. As we look forwards, how we're going to take the toolkit, and of course, how we're going to all be doing our own bit to do the climate action we're all going to do. How do you see what we're hearing pledged around COP26 appearing in energy legislation in particular? What do you expect to see popping up in terms of legislation in the next few years?
Thanks, Matt. I think the big announcement from Wednesday was the transition away from coal, and certain countries pledging that this will be enshrined in their policy, and it follows the pro-border legislation. I already mentioned it there. And I think coal will be a big focus, and it will just remain to be seen how this is actually implemented in practice.
Yeah, thanks, Fran. I think that's probably all we have time for. So over to you.
Actually, we have 2 minutes left. So if you want to ask one more question, yeah.
Well, in that case, probably Ben, if we can get Ben back on the screen. So the Law and Climate Change Toolkit, of course, is a legal tool, and it's about using the law to address climate change challenges. But of course, the way we understand the reality and effects and causes of climate change is through science. How can we bring more science into the experience of the toolkit and maybe incorporate get more science generally as we go forward with the toolkit.
Yeah, thanks, thanks, Matt. So obviously, in the fight against climate change, sound scientific knowledge is it's a really necessary first step to implementing reactive and proactive policy options. So in order to develop the toolkit, we've really largely worked in the past with organizations having legal divisions. But there is, for example, room to include organizations here that might have a firm understanding of the scientific side of a matter related to climate change in order to fill in the gaps that the legal individuals just don't have. So, for example, a scientific body with knowledge of water science or hydrogeology may be an excellent partner for future development of a module on water law, for example. And their knowledge would be invaluable to lawyers who may not have the scientific expertise necessary to understanding what questions should be asked related to legislation and what topics might be absent from the toolkit. So it doesn't necessarily, I suppose, have to be a legal organization or legal teams that develop the toolkit, but using the expertise from a variety of organizations who all have experience in the legal and scientific components of the development of law and policy would be a really valuable springboard into a bit of a broader form of toolkit. Yeah.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Matt. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And for those joining us from far, like Valerie, appreciate it. And please get in touch with us if you have any questions. Thanks.